As Democrats and Republicans work on a bipartisan immigration bill in the Senate and House Republicans look for every excuse to ignore it, the United States Supreme Court issued a surprising ruling siding with the Biden administration over the state of Texas regarding a border dispute. And it has infuriated MAGA Republicans so much that many of them are publicly calling for Texas to ignore the Supreme Court and get into a standoff with the federal government. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert buttons before you go. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, friends, there's a lot to unpack here. We're going to start with this breaking news clip from yesterday, which gives you about a 30-second summary of what's going on with respect to the Supreme Court decision.
Breaking news, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court says it will allow Border Patrol agents to remove razor wire installed by the state of Texas at the U.S.-Mexico border. The emergency request filed by the Biden administration argued that Texas was preventing Border Patrol from carrying out their duties. Again, breaking news, and Border Patrol will be allowed to cut down that razor wire, as you.
So that's the nature, right? This has been a dispute that's gone on for several months. As a matter of fact, we did a video about this. The inhumane attempts by Republican Governor Greg Abbott and, his henchmen in Texas, they've been wrapping razor wire around buoys, and it has resulted in fatalities. This was from back in August, I believe. 2 found dead in Rio Grande, where Texas's floating barrier and razor wire sparked federal lawsuit. That was a predicate. This didn't have so much to do with the razor wire as it was another contention recently between Texas law enforcement and federal authorities. And this is something that's been contested. Texas says one thing, the federal government says another. But a woman and 3 children, these were Mexican migrants, drowned near Eagle Pass, Texas. And the point of contention is, apparently, according to the federal government, they were aware of people being in danger. They attempted to intervene and save the migrants. And according to the federal government, they were physically barred from doing so by Texas law enforcement. Texas law enforcement says that didn't happen. They didn't know about the drowning migrants until they had already died. But again, this is how contentious the situation is, all right? So this Supreme Court, this right-wing conservative supermajority Supreme Court, in a split decision, right, they sided with President Biden and the Biden administration. I will note before we play some of the clips, that's good, but it's also kind of startling that so many conservative justices were willing to side with Texas over the federal government, given that border enforcement, whether you like it or not, under Republican or Democrat, is indeed the purview of the federal government, not Texas. So it's disturbing that so many conservatives felt that Texas was somehow on even or even superior footing with respect to the U.S.-Mexico border than the federal government under the Federal Supremacy Clause. So that aside, I want to play some clips, very short clips, from Laura Ingraham, because the context from this is she's very unhappy, of course, with the decision. And she also thinks, like many do, that this should undermine or scuttle the bipartisan deal that Senate Democrats and Republicans are working on with respect to the border.
And this lawsuit against Texas should effectively end any future negotiations with the Biden White House on the border.
Now, again, we played a clip where Laura Ingraham, we played this in a recent video, Laura Ingraham is publicly urging, like Speaker Mike Johnson, Kevin McCarthy's successor. She said this last week. She said, I just spoke to Donald Trump about this bipartisan Senate deal, and he is strongly insistent that you should just, reject the deal, right? Because Trump and MAGA want to use it as a wedge issue. They know that President Biden and Democrats, right or wrong, poll poorly on the border, right? And so they want to use it as a wedge issue to punish Biden in the election. They have no interest whatsoever in resolving the issue because they're terrified that Biden will get credit for it. A completely different approach to how Democrats handled coronavirus with Donald Trump when he was president, right? During an election year, they worked with him knowing to pass 2 COVID relief bills, knowing that he would be the one to get the credit for the COVID relief. But that's because, for all their faults, Democrats are infinitely more likely to work in good faith with Republicans during a crisis than vice versa. So now Laura Ingraham is saying, listen, this Supreme Court ruling, right, because the Supreme Court issued this ruling in favor of the Biden administration, that should just scuttle any legislation to deal with the border. Marco Rubio, a Senate Republican, said effectively the same thing. How can there be a border security deal with a Biden administration that just went all the way to the Supreme Court to stop border security? Well, no, the Biden administration went to the Supreme Court to assert its federal authority and responsibility, which is supreme over the border compared to the states. That's just basically the Biden administration marking its territory in line with the Constitution, and it had every right to do so. But he went on, Laura Ingraham, to effectively make the same case.
But all of this is all Biden wants. He wants to reach a bipartisan deal with Republicans in the Senate, then have the House not pass it. And then he can go around saying, look, we tried. The crazy Republican MAGA people in the House wouldn't do it. So now they own the border crisis.
So maybe the MAGA Republicans in Congress, the crazy MAGA Republicans, should pass the bipartisan deal, especially when it has Senate Republican support, because it's not like Senate Republicans aren't in their own way crazy. It's not like MAGA Republicans don't exist in the Senate, right? So it goes beyond that, though. So Marco Rubio is basically trying to put the onus on Biden when, in fact, he just made a case that it's Mike Johnson's responsibility to help. Mike Johnson and House Republicans also have a responsibility to govern, even when they're in the relative minority. They're still in the majority in the House, right? They have a duty to help Democrats govern. But beyond that, somebody responded to Marco Rubio here. Disingenuous argument. The Biden administration didn't go to SCOTUS, Supreme Court, to stop border security. They went to SCOTUS to stop Texas from actively trying to kill migrants. There are plenty of effective ways to address the border without being cruel, which is true. Clay Higgins, a MAGA Republican, in response to the Supreme Court, just went bananas, as he usually does. He's one of the crazier MAGA Republicans. He says, he posts a hypothetical media. Congressman Higgins, the Supreme Court just ruled in favor of the Biden admin over the state of Texas, saying that the federal government can remove physical barriers at the border put in place by Texas. What are your thoughts? Higgins says, my thoughts are that the feds are staging a civil war and Texas should stand their ground. You have MAGA Republicans openly saying that this is a civil war and encouraging states to defy the federal government. Higgins absolutely would have been a Confederate. Just FYI, if we were in 1861, 1860, he would absolutely be a Confederate, demanding that South Carolina fire on Fort Sumter and all of the states secede. It's so despicably gross from a so-called patriotic pro-American party. Marjorie Taylor Greene says, outrageous. The Constitution says the role of the federal government is to defend the states from invasion, but Homeland Secretary Mayorkas and his boss, Joe Biden, refuse to uphold the law and protect our country. Now SCOTUS says Texas can't even defend itself. Well, again, we know that there is border security, that the Biden administration, even if you don't think it's doing enough, is indeed executing border security. They need funding from Congress, right? They need more resources from Congress. Biden can't do it himself because he's the executive, not the legislature. He doesn't control the purse strings. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, who also wants to scuttle a bipartisan border deal on behalf of her master, Donald Trump, should probably do her duty and give President Biden and the Biden administration the resources they need to more adequately defend the border to her satisfaction. But again, the fact that Biden is doing it to the best of his ability and in ways with which she disagrees, that doesn't mean that Biden is not enforcing the border. Chip Roy, Republican in the House, says this opinion is unconscionable and Texas should ignore it on behalf of Border Patrol union agents who will be put in a worse position by this opinion and the Biden administration's policies. So not necessarily advocating for civil war, but advocating for Texas, for Republicans in Texas to simply defy a Supreme Court ruling, a conservative majority Supreme Court. It's so funny. They talk about how they're the party of law and order and how important it is to, honor the Supreme Court when conservatives are in power. But it's not even apparently when conservatives are in power. It's actually just when conservatives are in power and rule on cases the way that conservatives like. Then you should follow the Supreme Court. Then everybody should follow the Supreme Court. But otherwise, really, just we can ignore them. Governor Greg Abbott says this is not over. Texas's razor wire is an effective deterrent to the illegal crossings Biden encourages. I will continue to defend Texas's constitutional authority to secure the border and prevent the Biden administration from destroying our property, suggesting that Governor Greg Abbott, too, is strongly considering defying the United States Supreme Court and the federal government. Again, crazy stuff, folks. It doesn't just stop there. It's also right-wing commentators, Tucker Carlson. So it's unanimous. Everyone in power, from the White House to the hedge fund managers to the Supreme Court of the United States, has decided to destroy the country by allowing it to be invaded. That leaves the population to defend itself. Where are the men of Texas? Why aren't they protecting their state and the nation? You have Tucker Carlson, formerly the biggest right-wing commentator in mainstream media advocating for insurrection in its own way or rebellion, right? You need to rise up, commit uprising against the federal government and the Supreme Court. Charlie Kirk says, I never thought I'd see the day where the federal government actively fights a state, all the way to the Supreme Court to expedite illegal invasion of America and wins. I'm angry, but I'm also sad with what this means for our future. And then he goes on to say, because of course, to Charlie Kirk, more brown people in this country is anathema to him, disgusting in that respect. But folks, I do want to leave you with this here. All right. So there was a recent House Oversight Committee hearing with respect to the border, and a guy named, I think, David Beyer. He is a researcher at the Cato Institute, a right-wing libertarian policy think tank, right? They are certainly no progressives or even liberals. This is what David Beyer had to say about the Biden administration and border policy.
Mr. Beer, given the feedback of these chief patrol agents, is it credible in your view for Republicans to characterize border security under the current administration as weaker than under the last administration?
Not at all. I mean, if you look at 2019, for example, you had almost 1 million encounters that year, which was half of the level that we're seeing now. And yet, despite having much lower total numbers, they still weren't removing a higher share than the Biden administration did. So yes, there's been more resources put in. There's been more effort by this administration. I mentioned the number of removals being the highest since 2001. So the idea that they're not putting in the effort is really, I mean, it's offensive to the Border Patrol agents who are doing their job.
So there you have it. That's coming from a right-wing libertarian immigration expert from the Cato Institute, right? If anything, there's plenty to criticize President Biden's border policy from the left, right? I mean, here's where we are. A conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court was unable to side with Texas, right? A majority of the Supreme Court still sided with the United States federal government, saying that, listen, the United States government, the federal government, has supremacy over the U.S.-Mexican border, and they have a right to remove Texas's barbaric anti-humanitarian razor wire, which has resulted in the deaths of migrants. And in response, you have Texas officials like Greg Abbott. You have Republican elected officials either advocating for rebellion or non-acquiescence, just straight up ignoring a Supreme Court decision. You have right-wing commentators doing the same. And then you have others saying that the outcome of this decision, right, should affect a bipartisan deal in the Senate designed to deal with the very crisis that Republicans complain about. This whole thing, folks, at the end of the day, is this. They don't care about rule of law. They don't even care about rule of law when it's decided by conservatives, because there's still a possibility that that's not going to get them the outcome they want. This is a cult of personality that wants to give a wedge issue to Donald Trump to try to use as a cudgel against President Biden in the 2024 election. They do not love this country. They do not love rule of law. It's all about the specific outcome. That's simply a fact, and this proves it. Let me know what you think in the comments.